Welcome to the third and last session of Neurotheology number 3. So we're looking at slide 2.5a, evolutionary creation. And here we come to Professor Jürgen Moltmann. Some of you may not know about him. He's the last of the great German theologians alive today. And he is, I think, close to 80 years old. He, along with his counterpart, Wolfhard Pannenberg, almost single-handedly in the 60s transformed modern theology after the death of Karl Barth. Moltmann was a German in the Nazi army, conscripted at the age of 17 or 18, and became prisoner of war in Great Britain. I think it's Manchester. And of course, like many young people in Germany, he didn't want to be a Nazi. He was conscripted and he didn't know anything about it. He wanted to study with Albert Einstein on physics. But in one of his retellings of the story, a bomb came down on a friend, a close friend, while he was talking to a friend like that, and didn't explode. But the friend was basically crushed into a pancake, and he died just like that. And the shock to him was, one moment I'm talking to my best friend, the next moment, nothing. How do I understand God under those circumstances? Striking, right? Fast forward, he was a prisoner of war in Manchester, and a kind-hearted Christian theologian went to the prisoner of war camp, and he says, we are now, for reasons that none of us wanted, are at war with each other, killing human beings. Can you imagine how stupid this sounds? It's so hard to live, and we are killing each other in the war, the Second World War. Anyone who's interested, I'm willing to start a seminary in the prisoner of war camp, and I will teach about the things of God. Quite amazing. That little beginning for this young man led to become one of the greatest thinkers in the 21st century. So Moltmann began to study with this guy, and he began to write a string of books. What's interesting about him was he basically said, talk about things to haunt us, right? I don't believe in a thing called systematic theology because you can't systematize God, right? Fair enough. So he began to write individual books. I've got, I think most of them are somewhere there, a whole bunch of them. Eventually, all his books became what? His systematic theology. You cannot escape what you think you want to escape so much, right? Now, he had two areas that made him distinguish. One was on the Holy Spirit. He wrote on the Spirit, and he partly drew from another German thinker of the 19th century, a guy called Hegel. So a lot of people know the name Hegel. The other area that distinguished him is called a theology of hope. He began to work on the idea of hope. What does hope mean? What does it mean to have Christian hope? And he doesn't want a simple mumbo-jumbo, yeah, I'll just close my eyes and everything be wonderful, because he's been through suffering. He has seen death close up. He understands that. Now, today, I'm not interested in discussing the issue of Christian hope in his world, because it's so dense, he won't do justice to rush through like that. But I wanted to say that in 1984, he won the Gifford Lecture Prize. It's a prize given every year by 4 ancient universities in Scotland: Aberdeen, St. Andrews, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. I think that's right. And they are considered the Nobel Prizes of theology, except they don't come at $1.5 million, right? When you win a Gifford Lecture, it means for the next year or so, you are given a chance for almost a year to write your greatest life's work. And it started in 1901. The first winner was William James, the professor of psychology at Harvard University. And his Gifford Lectures was The Varieties of Religious Experiences. So normally a Gifford Lecture book is a very substantial, mature thought of a thinker. Lord Gifford, when he gave money for this lectureship, his idea was that you will use the natural sciences. By that, he doesn't mean experimental science. He also means psychology, anything to do with knowledge, to better understand the nature of God. That was the mark of the Gifford Lecture. So there are 4 given every year. And I count it a great privilege to have studied under 6 Gifford lecturers, which is, I think, almost a record. One of them was Marilyn McCord Adams, who wrote on Ockham. She's a Gifford lecturer. John Hare, Gifford lecturer. Nicholas Wolterstorff, Gifford lecturer. Wenzel van Heijsteen, my advisor, he won his Gifford lecture in 2004, and his book came out in 2006. Took 2 years to write Gifford lectures, and To my knowledge, he is the first and only Gifford lecturer in Princeton Seminary's history. That's quite stunning.
Oh.
Yale, I think, has 4, but that's because Yale is part of a major university. So the professors at the Divinity School are also professors of Department of History, so it's different. Lamin Sane, my professor of history at Yale, also a Gifford lecturer. So I've been close enough to see what happens when you win such a major prize at such a late age. You're normally in the 60s, by the way, and you're given 2 years. And you've ever listened to a Gifford lecture, it's not one lecture, it's normally 6. So it's quite amazing. So if you attend, say, a Gifford lecture in Edinburgh University, you go there and you got to find 6 days in your time to sit down and listen. And most people are in their 60s because they are at the late stage of their career. You may not know this, but theology is one of the few areas in the world of study where your high water mark is normally reached around the age of 65. Younger than that, you are too young to really do any serious work in theology, believe it or not. Right or wrongly, that's it. And that's why those who survive to 65 and all that, who can do their major work, they live to the 80s and 90s. That's the way it is. But in any case, so Moltmann's Gifford lecture is a book called Creation, God in Creation, not God of Creation, God in Creation. And I use that as my conversation partner for chapter 2. Now, I can explain about how PhD works in theology. So in theology, nobody cares what you think as a student because you're too young, you know too little to talk about theology, because theology encompasses so many fields of inquiry, right? So what they advise you to do is pick a major thinker, preferably still alive, so you can ask him questions and learn his work really, really well, and then engage with it. And that became the essence of my chapter 2. Today, we're going to go through, I would say, about a fifth of it, because the whole chapter 2 is just too dense to do that. But I only talk about bara and asa, the difference between creation and made, how God made. So in my case, and by the way, I'm mentioning all this because in the future, some of you who wonder, what is it like to do a PhD in theology? It's one of the longest PhDs in the world. It's typically between 7 to 8 to 9 years, full time. That's what a serious interdisciplinary PhD actually takes. So you don't do it for fun, right? So in a conversation with a major thinker, you can choose Karl Barth, Jonathan Edwards. I chose Jürgen Moltmann, partly because he knew the sciences very well. He knew biological evolution very well. In the old German system of studying theology, you study the Bible, you study theology, you study languages, you study history, and then you must choose one of the sciences, either chemistry, physics, mathematics, or biology. And when they say choose a science, they don't mean I read a book here and there. They mean you actually do the real heavy lifting of the natural sciences. Otherwise, you're not a theologian. Something that we don't do in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is kind of why we don't really have major thinkers at the level of the Germans have. Because the Germans, you must do 2 doctorates in order to teach. One is called your PhD, and then after the PhD, you do another doctorate called, I think, called the habilitation, another one, in order to be good enough to teach. What America did was, they took 2 of that and combined into a super thing called a PhD, so that in Germany, when you do a PhD, you start writing your dissertation immediately. It'll take you 3 years, then you work for a while, and then you do the second PhD. In America, what they did was, before you're allowed to even do a dissertation, you spend 2 to 3 years doing courses before you even get to do a PhD. So that extends to a very long PhD. In any case, Jürgen Moltmann was interested in how to understand God's creation in the context of the fact that we have a lot of internal problems with the theology. How can, on the one hand, we say Jesus is God and yet human? We're crossing the divide between human and God, right? And yet we distinguish between God's creation and God. He realized that the Jewish world of Zimzun used another term, and then he didn't mention it, but he was aware. Hinduism has a very strong understanding that divine and human are intertwined at some level. We call it pantheism. Pan means, all of it, and theism is God is in all. He introduced another concept called panentheism, so that not that God and humans are identical, but that God has to indwell the human spirit in order for us to make sense. When we say, I feel God's presence, what the heck does that mean, right? And because he's also a scientist, he dared to ask questions that most theologians don't even know how to ask. He said, what does that mean? And then he says, when we die, we say, we'll be with God in heaven. Okay, let's cut to the chase. What does that mean from a biological perspective, from a perspective of science? So my sadness about it is when he dies, probably in the next few years, we will have lost the last of the great German thinkers who brought in a very comprehensive worldview, which we no longer have today. Very, very rare. Professor Van Heijsteen was the first professor of science and theology in the world when Princeton opened a chair for him. He retired 2 or 3 years ago, and the sad reality is that his chair was not filled. So they're not filling the chair. It's a one-time deal and it's over. So can you imagine how lucky I felt that I happened to be around at the time when he was at his prime, and then it's over now. Okay, distinguish between bara and asa. These are 2 Hebrew words. One means create and one means to make. If you look at the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, in the notes I gave you, the detailed notes, you'll find something very strange. The church began to shift between make or create. They're not quite sure which one they want. But in Hebrew, they are very distinct terms. So he exegeted the creation narrative into an originating creation in the heavens and the earth and humanity, Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:27, and a transformative crafting. So for him, creation, the word bara means creation, and the word make is transforming. Transforming as if, for example, cooking, right? You take the natural ingredients, flour, eggs, water, a bit of butter, and you transform into a cake. That's making. That is not creation. Creation is suddenly there were atoms, and suddenly you have butter, and suddenly you have water, suddenly you have flour. So these are 2 very different things. So he wanted to say that in terms of the heavens and the earth, it was creation. In terms of humanity, it was making, the making of man, because humans came from pre-existing material. That's what we use in the church. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return when you do a funeral. God created, not in time, the heavens and earth, but God made in 6 days creation, light, water, land, life forms. The beginning is the precondition of time itself and does not begin time. It was not the beginning of time, so that the beginning was not part of time. Creation is timeless, but not eternal. I just read 2 or 3 sentences and it can be lost so quickly, right? Because he jumps to so many points. Read it for yourself in the notes. In the slides, it's just condensed into a slide, but when you go back and you read through the notes again, try to make sense of it and read some questions if you have any, right? Note that only the creation of the heavens and the earth was accomplished with no preconditions, such as, and God said. And therefore, a paraphrase that refers only to Genesis 1:1. So he's saying the only thing that God created was in Genesis 1:1. Everything else was not creation, God made. Okay? Now, what does that do for us? It means as we go to next session, when we go to human beings, you can now see that the scientific understanding of where humans come from is not out of thin air. It is evolutionary. It came from previous other animals. So it fits into the biblical perspective, is what Moltmann is trying to say. The Bible never said that humans came from out of thin air, because the word used for humans is asa, to make, not to create. In the English language, we kind of interuse the 2 words, and we are very sloppy with translations for a long time. We just use the word make or create accordingly. But in the Hebrew text, it's very specific. The making of space or divine withdrawal of creation tells us of the kenosis of God. So he says, because God is everything, when God created, God had to reduce God's self. It's called withdrawal, called kenosis, right? Now, what does that mean? It's almost as if in order for a child to have a voice, the parents have to say, I'm going to withdraw my power, so I permit you to speak. A parent can say, I control everything. You cannot speak because I take up all the space. So in that sense, you can see we're moving towards love, right? The idea of God's love is God doesn't project the full power, withdraws and withholds so that you are allowed to have a voice to speak. So that creation is a confirmation of God's sacrifice. What emerges from the withdrawal, then he says, is nothing. Now, don't be fooled by the word nothing. Theologically, nothing is not nothing. The affirmative force of God's self-negation, which becomes the creative force. of salvation. What does it say? No battery. I think that battery is also dead. Okay, that's fine. We have one going. And so basically pay attention to the word in that slide that talks about God forsakenness. In God creating, there's a button on the left hand side, on the side. Is it on? The lights are on? Okay. So basically, when God created, God had to forsake something in order for it to be around. So for example, if this is all there is, and God doesn't create, God fills up the entire glass. But when God creates, God has to reduce God's self in a sense and make space for creation. That space is also called God forsaken. Makes sense, right? God forsakes it. If God forsakes a space, of course you would expect the space to have bad things. Sinfulness, evil, wickedness. So that's how he explains why nature is cruel. It's called theology. How do you explain that God, who is a living God, can create a world that is not living? Right? In order for the world to exist, God must not exist in that space. Do you follow? Mm-hmm. Right? So think about child and parents again, right? For the parents to allow the child to have freedom, you have to take the risk that a child could fall down and hurt itself, skin the knees, learning to ride a bicycle, you fall. These are all the risks of creation. So go back and read the full notes on the slide as I give you some summaries. And if you're really interested in the book, it's page 87, but don't worry about the book. Now, question from Chris Ong. So Chris, pay attention. So Chris asked this question. It's in your slides. Do you have the slides? First question. Has Moltmann addressed the theory of general relativity? This is Einstein's theory that unifies space and time. He said, as far as I know, separating space and time and the creation of each as separate events is not possible. So what Chris is asking is, how can Moltmann say that God creates space and then God creates time, when in fact space-time is together? So here's my answer. Moltmann does not address Einstein's space-time theory because he does not need to. Now I mentioned this because remember, Moltmann was preparing to study with Einstein. So he doesn't know anything about it. Moltmann knows what he's talking about. Here's the reason why. Moltmann is referring to time and space before the Big Bang, before all the cousin physical laws existed. So by the same token, Einstein did not address the emergence of space and time simply because origins are not within the scope of science. God created time and space that we now think of as space-time, but experience as separate elements because we are 3D and we're not 4D creatures. So here's what I'm trying to say in all of this. Why did Moltmann say God can create space and then God create time as separate things? Our idea of space-time as one unit is after the Big Bang. Before the Big Bang, there were no physical laws. So it is legitimate for Moltmann to not address whether God can, why didn't God create space-time as one composite unit? That composite unit of space-time is an experience. We experience time because we grow older, we know there's a past, there's a present, there's a future. But this is a very human experience. We have no idea whether it's real, by the way. Experiences may not be real. They are what I call experiences. So think about that, okay, Chris, and come back if you have any questions on this. It's partly because creation is about before something happens. The idea that space and time is connected together is it's called an ex post facto, after the fact event. Now, second question Chris asks is, sin is defined as idolatry, a distortion of our relationship with God. But in Berean class last year, or earlier this year, we say we characterize scripture as theological reflections, not necessarily verifiable, right? So I think he's asking, how can we now say there's a God, or God is personal, or God is this and God is that? Or even whether God is omnipotent, if there's only one and if there's a heavenly council. So he's saying, since we can't verify the claim of the Bible, how can we claim God is this and God is that? The answer I've given, and you're quite free to discuss this with a bit of time. Christians believe in a God that over time was portrayed in various forms, some of them inconsistent. This is a shocking thing to understand. Christianity has not had a straight one idea of God. it has shifted over time. Remember we said evolution of God? So that's one thing. Belief is not knowledge. That's another thing. To believe in something is not the same thing as you know it to be knowledge. It's to believe in something. What are some of the things you believe in that you do not know for sure is knowledge? Not to do with God, just other things.
A lot of science.
Okay, give me some very specific examples.
Of belief, not knowledge.
Yeah.
I believe my mother loves me.
Yeah, okay. But do you know for sure? Not really. She can lie to your street. I go further. You believe that your mother is your mother. That's pretty scary, right? How do you know if your father or your mother is really your father or your mother? At the end of the day, you don't know, because the human brain does not keep memories of babies until up till the age of 3. No human we know of can remember when they were born, where they were born, who talked to them, no sound. And one reason is the brain isn't developed yet to construct long-term memory consolidation. It's not that the child is a defect. Most of the growing of the brain happens after birth. It's a rare thing in animal kingdom, but the human mind is so fascinating. The 9 months in the baby's belly, in the mother's belly, the body grows, but the brain connections are not finalized. They are finalized after the baby is born, so that the first few years of learning are really crucial. You can make a huge difference between a super intelligent child and someone who is seriously compromised if they don't have a parent's love. And that's why orphanages are so tragic because of this. The early years of a child makes all the difference. Okay, so the believer adopts the authority that the Bible is supremely authoritative, or he does not. Christians have long been divided on this. Most famously, Catholic and Orthodox Christians do not share Protestant Christianity's high view of the Bible that arose in the 16th century. So here's one thing to remember. What we inherited as Protestants, our view of the Bible as being supreme authority, is not a historical view of the Christian church. It is a specific view largely pushed by Martin Luther in Sola Scriptura in the 16th century. And we adopted that, and that's all we know. But if you go back before the 16th century, including Martin Luther himself, he has not seen the Bible as dramatically important as we have adopted it today. The Bible is one of the resources, but for them, there were other resources that was also very important, including, believe it or not, for Martin Luther, dreams. And that's why for him, the dream he had, that Mary's mother, called Anna and all that, made him so anguished that he wanted to ask forgiveness and pray and all that sort of stuff that shaped his thinking. In Judaism, it takes an even lower view. In Judaism, what is more important is not the Hebrew Bible, it is the Midrash. Hi, come and say hi to the video so people can see who you are. This is the youngest member of ACT. Can you see the video? Hi there, this is Lucas. Can you see that? Okay, now, any comments on this for Chris' second question? No? He asked a question, if we cannot prove the Bible to be true, why do we have beliefs like idolatry, this, that, the other? Why do we have beliefs? And it's a very good question, by the way. Any comments on this? Or you want to think about it and come back next week? Okay. Okay, last question, the third question. One needs to start from the assumption and not try to prove or verify the Bible is authoritative, and can, without proof, be incorporated into an interdisciplinary theory. So his question really is this. And I think, Chris, you are facing what a lot of us faced, and some of us still face today. Once you know that the Bible's history is such, right, that it is not pristine, it has internal contradictions, and it's a human document, it's really hard to believe in anything if you can't have an authoritative structure, right? So here's my answer to you. The church does assume the authority of the Bible without verification. It's called the theory of basic beliefs in epistemology. In fact, you heard about the term Reformed theology. Michael, you're very into this. So when you come back from Cuba, read through this, okay? Reformed theology begins with the idea that how we know the Bible is true is because it is, period. You don't ask questions. And then we say, but can't I ask why you think it's true? Well, it's a basic belief, meaning it's a belief that cannot be questioned. It justifies itself. Now, the problem begins not with the Bible, believe it or not, but with the interpretations of the Bible. So it doesn't matter what Bible you have. At the end of the day, our differences are not Bibles. It's interpreting the Bible. So in fact, what we call biblical authority is a disguised form of the preacher's interpretive authority, since there's no standard interpretation of the Bible. Do you follow that? Mm-hmm. If I give you a verse of the Bible and you have 4 preachers preaching it, they will preach different things. And no one's going to call the other a liar. So what has developed in the Christian world is basically the authority has never been on the Bible. We keep claiming it, but in reality it's the interpreter's authority that really matters. So we say things like, I like that sermon because it speaks to me. You can have the same reference, another person preacher says, I don't like the sermon because he doesn't speak to me. So it was never the Bible. Same Bible. You are looking for interpretations. If you like the interpretation, it will speak to you and you will say it's a good sermon. If you don't like the interpretation, it'll be a bad sermon and he said it doesn't speak to you. So at a certain point in philosophy, we call it reader response. The reader's response to the book becomes more important than the book itself. A second problem, Lucas, listen to me, Lucas. A second problem is that we do not extend this assumption to people of other faith. Right, Lucas? Yep. I don't know where you're at now. Are you at Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity? But wherever you are at, think about this. We don't allow the other people of other faith to have a Bible or their sacred text and then to say that theirs is a basic belief. So we are quite happy to judge other people's sacred books. We don't like them to judge our sacred books. As someone said, I think it's a Jewish rabbi, he says to an atheist, it's quite remarkable how the atheists have such incredible clarity on the failure of the theist books. That means you are quite sure you know why the others are wrong. You're very, very sure of that, in a way that you're not sure why you're right. Then because I said other people of other faith equally prefer to assume that their sacred text is correct and by definition the Bible is wrong. This is why no interdisciplinary theology can accept this low standard because it is not intellectually honest. Now for me, so let me share a quick autobiographical issue. As I mentioned before, one of my professors at Yale was a gifted lecturer and his name is Nicholas Wolterstorff. He, along with another guy called Alvin Plantinga, were the founders of Reformed theology's epistemology, why we believe the Bible to be right. And at the base, it's basically because it is. Sounds silly, right? But when you put it into 50 pages, it sounds very clever. It's called a basic belief. It is true and it should not be questioned. Otherwise, Christianity fails on this context. Years after I left Yale, as I kept on thinking about it, I can no longer take that view because I think it's quite a low standard intellectually. You're not, sorry?
It's a bully.
Yeah, in the sense of a bully. If you don't, then you're not a Christian, that kind of thing. Okay, Chris, I hope this partly answers your issues, but do write in to respond to that, and we'll discuss it more. Now we'll come to the last bit, the transformation of doctrine of creation, 26a. So here is where I'm proposing in my chapter 2 a kind of doctrine of creation that is transformative and is evolutionary. Why? Because it's a viable way to prepare for a doctrine of theological anthropology. My understanding of creation is the whole universe, right? I'm now preparing for chapter 3 next week, where we go through humanity. How did humans come about? A theological anthropology that accounts for findings in paleoanthropology. So the difference between theological anthropology, which is the spiritual understanding of God in relation to relationship to God, and paleoanthropology, which is really dead people, right? We're looking at how they came about. There are 2 different fields looking at the same thing, humans. And then I mentioned 2 other fields, primatology, which is a study of primates, the study of the nearest animals to the human body, which are the great apes. There are 3 great apes, the gorillas of Rwanda and Uganda, the orangutans of Borneo and Sumatra, and the third one of the chimpanzees, mostly found in Tanzania and Kenya. And finally, neuroscience. The question is the biological evolution of approximately true description of life in the universe? So we ask the question, did the whole universe evolve just like we evolve and just like the Earth? Or is it limited to the planet Earth? And the answer obviously is, It has to be universal. Because, I tell you why, it is from the stars that we come from. In a sense that every human body are made of different elements. Hydrogen, helium, iron, silicon, all these various elements. And these elements are not, they are found on Earth, obviously, but the Earth came from the stars exploding called supernova. So, if the universe's rules don't match our rules, we won't exist. We exist because they all follow the same rules of physics and chemistry. 26b, I propose a transformative doctrine of creation that fuses, don't worry about all these long terms, a protological doctrine of creation. Proto meaning beginning, and an eschatological doctrine of redemption. Eschatology means the last, at the end. So beginning at the end, right? By reversing the flow of divine history. Unlike process theology and panentheism, don't worry about these terms as well. In the notes, I give you the footnotes explain what they are. The open future that unfolds into the present preserves a free will agency of creation alongside the sovereignty of the creator by a kenotic framework to explain the nature of autopoiesis or self-creation by God's co-creators. I deliberately put this long sentence here just to give you a glimpse of what is it like to read theological treatise.
Nice.
Nice, right?
Thank you.
And you won't believe it. If I didn't write like this, I will fail in a PhD.
Oh.
Because it is so precise, that single sentence. You need the precision so that the professor reading it will know that you covered all the grounds, you didn't miss here, didn't miss that. But for the average reader, it's dead boring, right? So in the past, I've been writing more for the average reader, and now this last slide, I just put one thing to explain to you. In this single sentence, you must understand what is process theology. You must understand what is panentheism. You must understand what is an open future that unfolds into the present, preserves a free will agency of creation alongside the sovereignty of the creator. You must know what is a kenotic framework. You must know what is autopoiesis or self-creation by God's co-creators. Don't worry about all that. It's mentioned in the full text. Here, it is simply to say the new doctrine of creation I'm addressing is one that allows you to be created by God, God's sovereignty, and yet you have freedom of will. And we will discuss more of that in weeks 3 and 4 before your 5-week break to digest all this stuff. In this view, God's original creation, perhaps what cosmologists call the Big Bang, the future is open and we are free to exercise our wills with no divine restraint. Meaning what? No such thing as God's will. Oh, ouch. No such thing as God's will, Charles.
What?
Because once you have God's will, you cannot have freedom of decision-making process at all. Now, what happens in reality is this. We are addicted to the idea of God's will. We like to say, I want to do God's will. You know that God's will, if God has a will that must be so, it must be so 100%. It cannot be 80% God's will, otherwise it makes a mockery of the point of God's will. So what we do is, we make decisions, there are certain outcomes, and then we shoehorn in God's will and say that must be God's will. It is so sloppily used that no one ever calls to question. How, number one, how do we know it's God's will? How come God's will seems to shift according to advantages that you might have? So for example, you have a choice of 2 jobs. In one job, you're going to follow Mother Teresa for the rest of your life and live in India. And the other job, you become a hedge fund manager, right, in Palo Alto. It's not surprising, a lot of people feel God called them to Palo Alto. Very rare to be a Mother Teresa, right? Even supposing you become a Mother Teresa, how do you know that that's God's will? The whole point of God giving freedom is so that you have a choice of making decisions. Now, let's come to salvation issues. Earlier on I mentioned most of us have great-grandparents or grandparents who are not Christians. According to classical Christian tradition, they will live forever and they will burn forever in hell forever. Right? Was it God's will or their will that they are in that situation? If you say it is God's will for everything, then you have to blame God that they're in that situation. Not a very nice way to think about God. If you say it is not God's will, that they made a choice, then you can no longer say God is sovereign. You see the problem? Because we identify sovereignty of God with things that God will do no matter what we think. But in all the writings we have of the Bible, you can clearly see that God gives us free will. The evidence we have? Well, Adam and Eve made a choice. Moses, Noah. Who else do we have? King David, King Solomon. They all express freedom of will, choices that are clearly not God's will, because it even says so in the biblical text. right? God didn't want it, they did it.
He also planted bad thoughts in people's heads.
Lying
Routinely.
spirits,
Yeah.
Hardening the heart.
hardening the heart. Oh, that's a rough one, right? Remember the day we did PT? A lot of people had trouble with that. In fact, there were some people when did Project Timothy harden the heart. It was a question, and some people were visibly angry, not because we discussed it.
Sure, when I read it in the Bible, when I read the Bible, to me, it didn't seem like it had a whole lot of free will.
They were angry because it looks like it doesn't make sense, and why no one told them about that, right? Okay, could you press the button, kill that? I don't know why, it's a slow battery, but we're going to finish anyway. Okay, so in this view, we have the originalites, we are God's creators. Now let's look at the conclusion, 27a. So in this chapter, I'm going to summarize this chapter this week, and then I'm going to talk about next week, which is really interesting. In this chapter, we find that the Bible is consonant with evolutionary creation by natural selection because the doctrine of creation affirms the intentional appearance of material reality. That's God's creations, universe, life, and us. Okay, so that's all the Bible is concerned about. While the science of origins postulates the origin of energy matter. So they're looking at different things. They are not in conflict. Now, next week, more interesting. In next chapter, we turn to what Christians believe about the relationship between God and humanity through the doctrine of theological anthropology, sometimes called the doctrine of Imago Dei. I think some of you did the whole seminar on image of God, and you can remember how complex it was. We read 4 different books. So looking back, I don't know how you guys did it, but it was tough. You got it in 5 weeks, right? We shall learn what scientists have inferred from the past 150 years of discoveries through the field of paleoanthropology. So this is all next week. Theology is interested in the relational aspect of being human, while science is interested in the physical aspect of human evolution. So theology is about relationship. Science is about the physical aspect. Where did the humans come from? How do we have these bones of all these hobbits and these people? However, so very often Christians read the Bible to look for scientific knowledge about human origins, and finding none, make it up as they have done for almost 2,000 years. And I was among them. When I preach, when I wrote, when I write, even at seminary, it's quite stunning. Instinctively, we know that the Bible is not a science book, but the temptation is so great to make it a science book because we want the Bible. A part of it is jealousy, right? In the world of faith, we are jealous that the world of science seems to have such interesting stuff. So interesting, we use it all the time. Because theology hasn't invented the aeroplane or the submarine or the ship or the gun, or it doesn't invent anything. But science seems to have all these fantastic things like iPhone 7 Plus, right? Like the iPad Pro, all this amazing stuff. We love it. So there's a bit of a intellectual jealousy. So we try to make the text become like the science because the science will become the new high priest of knowledge. But it's ridiculous to do that. We do that, and I was among them. You can now see why many scientific explanations of human origins tend to be disturbing to many readers of the Bible. Because they thought the Bible tells them about human origins, and now it seems like the story in the Natural History Museum doesn't match the story in the Bible, and we get upset. 27b. Our interest in developing an interdisciplinary study of humanity is to draw from these two very different quests to achieve a more integral understanding of the human experience. The image of God, Imago Dei, refers to how we might live in the belief that God intentionally created us and our eventual existence and seeks a relationship with us. Paleoanthropology and neuroscience interpret fossil or organic evidence to identify the hominid adaptations of bipedalism, walking on 2 legs, development of the mammalian prefrontal cortex. Our human brain is the only brain in the animal kingdom with something right in the front that sticks out. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And that is the area of judgment and imagination. It's very interesting. Without that, you can't really imagine that animal having a religious experience, because that's what it's optimized for. And cognitive fluidity, which enable the power of human speech. So next week, we're going to talk about how human speech was made possible on a biological level. More than any other achievement, speech led to the rewiring of the human brain and the evolution of moral cognition, the stepping stone to empathy, and eventually to the complex experience of love. So look at these 4 things, right? Speech led to moral cognition. Moral cognition, awareness of right and wrong. Moral cognition when become empathy. Empathy is feeling the other person's feelings. Pain, love, and all that. Empathize. And finally, love. And this will lead all the way to chapter 6. So this is the framework. So if I were you, before you read the notes of chapter 3, read through again this conclusion and see the flow of ideas before we get there, right? Okay, we're done. Any questions before we call it a day? It's been a long day, as a lot of you know, because we had a long break. Really, that's a real reason. Any questions? Okay, great. Thank you.